The wind howled across the barren plains of Wyoming territory, carrying with it the bitter taste of alkali dust and memories Jake Sullivan wished he could forget. Standing in the doorway of his weathered barn, he watched the storm clouds gather on the horizon, dark and menacing as the thoughts that plagued him each night. 3 years had passed since the fever took Mary and their boy, Thomas. 3 years of silence broken only by the lowing of cattle and the whisper of prairie grass. Jake ran a calloused hand through his graying hair. Though at 35 he was still young by most standards. The isolation of ranch life had aged him, carved deep lines around his eyes from squinting against the sun, and etched permanent furrows in his brow. His spread wasn't much 100 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and a cabin that felt too large for one man, but it was his, paid for with sweat and stubbornness. The approaching storm worried him. Late autumn tempests in these parts could be vicious, and his horses were skittish, pawing at the ground and whinnying their unease. Jake headed into the barn to check their stalls, his spurs jangling with each step, the familiar scent of hay and horseflesh wrapped around him like an old blanket, momentarily pushing aside the loneliness that clung to him tighter than his own shadow. Thunder cracked overhead, and the first fat drops of rain began pelting the barn roof. Jake had just finished securing the last stall when he heard its voices, barely audible above the storm's crescendo. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 on his hip. Visitors during a storm usually meant trouble. And trouble was something Jake had successfully avoided since Mary's passing. The barn door burst open, slamming against the wall with enough force to startle the horses. 3 figures stumbled inside, soaked through and shivering. Women. Jake's hand relaxed on his gun. Though wariness kept his muscles taut, they huddled together like wet cats, their dresses plastered to their forms, hair hanging in sodden ropes. "Please," the eldest gasped, water streaming down her face. "We mean no harm. We just need shelter from the storm." Jake studied them in the lantern light. The one who'd spoken looked to be in her late 20s, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that held a hardness beyond her years. The second appeared younger, perhaps 23 or 4, with defiant green eyes that met his gaze boldly despite her bedraggled state. The youngest couldn't have been more than 19, trembling like a leaf, whether from cold or fear. Jake couldn't tell. "Name's Jake Sullivan," he said finally. "This is my place." "I'm Margaret," the eldest said, hesitation flickering across her features. "These are my sisters, Rose and Catherine." Jake didn't miss the pause, the way Margaret's eyes darted to her sisters before speaking. False names, most likely. But then, a man who'd chosen solitude over society had little room to judge others' secrets. "There's a bunkhouse attached to the barn," Jake offered, gesturing toward the far end. "Hasn't been used in years, but it's dry. Got some blankets in there." Rose, the middle sister, stepped forward. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and Jake noticed bruising on her upper arm, purple-black against pale skin. "Think you can handle us all?" she asked, chin lifted in challenge. There was something in her voice, part jest, part warning, as if she was testing him. "I can handle minding my own business," Jake replied evenly. "Get yourselves dry. I'll bring some food." As he turned to leave, he caught Catherine's expression, wide-eyed terror barely masked by exhaustion. These women were running from something. That much was clear. The bruises, the fear, the false names, it all painted a picture Jake recognized. He'd seen enough broken people drift through the territories to know the signs. Back in his cabin, Jake gathered what provisions he could spare: salt pork, hardtack, a jar of preserved peaches Mary had put up the summer before she died. He added a bottle of whiskey from his medicinal supplies, useful for warming cold bones, and an old tin of salve for cuts and bruises. His movements were automatic, hands performing tasks while his mind churned. Getting involved meant complications. These women brought danger with them, He could smell it as surely as he could smell the coming rain. Yet, when he thought of turning them out into the storm, Mary's voice echoed in his memory. Jacob Sullivan, the good Lord didn't put us on this earth to turn our backs on folks in need. When he returned to the bunkhouse, he found them exactly as he'd expected, huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers that died the moment he appeared. Margaret had her arms around Catherine, who was crying silently. Rose stood apart, peering through a crack in the shuttered window, as if expecting pursuit even through the tempest. "Food," Jake said simply, setting down the supplies. "There's a stove in the corner. Matches on the shelf." "Why are you helping us?" Rose demanded, suspicion sharp in her voice. Jake considered the question. "Storm's no place for anyone to be wandering. Christian thing to do." "Not many Christians left in these parts," Margaret observed carefully. "No," Jake agreed. "Not many." He turned to leave, but Margaret's voice stopped him. "Mr. Sullivan, thank you." Jake nodded without looking back. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, but it was nothing compared to the tempest he sensed brewing within those three women. As he crossed back to his cabin, he found himself checking the loads in his rifle and ensuring his ammunition was dry. Old habits from his days riding with the Rangers, before Mary had gentled his rougher edges. That night, Jake didn't sleep. He sat by his window, Winchester across his lap, watching the bunkhouse. Once, he thought he saw movement in the darkness beyond the barn, but it might have been his imagination or the storm playing tricks. The women's lantern burned until nearly dawn, and he could occasionally see silhouettes passing by the windows, restless, watchful, afraid. When the first pale light crept across the prairie, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. Jake stepped onto his porch, breathing in the crisp air, and saw Rose emerge from the bunkhouse. She'd cleaned herself up, though her dress still bore the signs of hard travel. In the morning light, he could see more clearly the marks of violence, a healing cut on her lip, scratches on her hands as if she'd fought someone. Their eyes met across the muddy yard. She didn't smile, didn't wave, just stood there measuring him with those bold green eyes. After a moment, she spoke, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Storm's past, Mr. Sullivan, but I suspect you know we've got worse weather following us." Jake leaned against his porch post, keeping his expression neutral. "I suspect I do. Smart man would send us on our way." "Maybe so," Jake allowed. "But I never claimed to be smart, just stubborn." For the first time, Rose's lips curved in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Think you can handle us all? Jake Sullivan. Really handle what's coming?" Jake looked past her to where Margaret and Catherine now stood in the bunkhouse doorway, all three watching him with varying degrees of hope and wariness. He thought of his empty house, the silence that pressed against his eardrums each night, the grave markers on the hill that he visited every Sunday. "Guess we'll find out," he said finally. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of sage and rain-washed earth. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, harsh and wild. Jake had the unsettling feeling that his 3 years of solitude had just come to an abrupt end, and whatever these women were running from would soon be running straight into him. But as he watched the morning sun paint their faces with golden light, he found he didn't much mind. After all, a man couldn't hide from life forever, no matter how deep he buried himself in the prairie's vast emptiness. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last wisps of storm clouds as Jake watched the three sisters emerge fully from the bunkhouse. What struck him first wasn't their beauty, though even travel-worn and weary. They were handsome women, but the way they moved. These weren't town ladies playing at ranch work. Margaret hefted a water bucket with practiced ease. Rose automatically checked the barn door latches. And even young Catherine moved with the sure-footed grace of someone raised around livestock. "Mind if we tend to our horses?" Margaret asked, gesturing toward the barn. They've been patient through the storm, but they need care. Jake nodded. Curiosity piqued. Didn't see any horses when you came in. We tied them in the lean-to on the barn's far side. Rose explained. Didn't want to spook yours by bringing strange animals inside during the tempest. That showed more sense than Jake expected from desperate people fleeing through a storm. He followed them to the lean-to, where 3 horses stood patiently despite the night's ordeal. Good stock, he noted. Not fancy, but solid working animals. Well cared for despite showing signs of hard riding. Without being asked, the sisters set about their tasks. Margaret hauled water while Rose found the currycombs and began working over her bay mare. Catherine cooed softly to her paint pony, checking its hooves with gentle efficiency. Jake found himself standing idle in his own barn, watching them work with growing amazement. You weren't raised in town, he observed. Margaret glanced up from filling the water trough. Our father had a small ranch. Nothing grand, but we learned our way around stock. Her voice carried a note of pride tinged with loss. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Jake's initial wariness had given way to reluctant admiration. The sisters had not only tended their own animals but had mucked out 2 stalls, mended a broken gate latch with wire and ingenuity, and reorganized his tack room, which, he had to admit, had needed organizing for months. You always work this hard when you're supposed to be hiding? Jake asked Rose, who was adjusting the fit of a harness with expert hands. She flashed him a look that might have been amused. Idle hands are the devil's playground, Mr. Sullivan. Besides, we pay our debts. Nobody asked you to. Nobody had to, Margaret interrupted firmly. You gave us shelter. This is how we were raised. The noon meal was a simple affair, taken in Jake's too-quiet kitchen. Salt pork fried with potatoes, coffee black as tar, and the last of Mary's preserved peaches shared among them. Jake noticed how Catherine's eyes lingered on his bookshelf, a modest collection, but more than most ranch houses boasted. You read? He asked her. The girl's face lit up, the first genuine joy he'd seen from her. Yes, sir. Papa made sure we all could, but She trailed off, glancing at her sisters. Catherine's the scholar, Rose supplied. Could read before she could properly sit a horse. Papa used to joke she'd marry a schoolmaster or become one herself. Used to, Catherine repeated softly, her brightness dimming. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Margaret's jaw tightened, and she stared fixedly out the window. Jake recognized the look, the same expression he wore when folks asked after Mary. You're welcome to borrow any book that catches your fancy, Jake offered, hoping to ease the moment. They don't get much use these days. Catherine's grateful smile was answer enough. As the afternoon wore on, Jake found his carefully ordered solitude thoroughly disrupted. Margaret had taken over his kitchen, declaring it a shameful state for a grown man who ought to know better. The quiet criticism reminded him so strongly of Mary that he had to step outside, chest tight with memory. He found Rose by the corral, watching his horses with an appraising eye. She'd washed her face and retied her hair, and in the clean light of day, he could see she was prettier than first impression suggested. Not delicate pretty, there was too much strength in her jaw. Too much wildness in those green eyes, but striking in a way that made a man take notice. That's a fine stallion, she said, nodding toward his black Apache. Half Apache, half Mustang. Caught him wild 3 years back. He trusts you. It wasn't a question. She could see it in the way the horse responded to Jake's presence, ears pricking forward, moving closer to the fence. Trust takes time, Jake said carefully. Rose turned to face him fully. We're not criminals, Mr. Sullivan. I want you to know that. We've done nothing wrong except be born women without protection in a world that favors the strong and cruel. I didn't think you were criminals. No, she studied his face. Then what do you think we are? Jake considered his words. I think you're running from someone with enough power to make you desperate. I think that bruise on your arm didn't come from falling off a horse. And I think whatever's chasing you won't stop just because you found shelter in a storm." Rose's laugh was bitter. "Perceptive man, so why let us stay?" "Storm's not quite past." Jake said simply, "Besides, my fence has needed mending for months. Seems you folks know your way around wire and posts." This time her smile was real, transforming her face. "Think you can handle us all, Jake Sullivan, even knowing trouble's coming?" "Asked me that before. Answer hasn't changed." They were interrupted by Catherine's delighted cry from the house. She appeared in the doorway, clutching a leather-bound volume. "Mr. Sullivan, is this really Jane Eyre? I've only ever heard about it. Never seen a copy." "Mary special ordered it from Denver," Jake said, his voice rougher than intended. "Said every home should have some culture." Catherine's enthusiasm dimmed. "Oh, I shouldn't if it was your wife's. Books are meant to be read. Miss Mary would tan my hide if she knew I was letting them gather dust." The girl clutched the book like a treasure, and Jake felt something in his chest loosen a fraction. Mary would have liked these women, would have taken them under her wing without a second thought. As evening approached, Margaret called them in for supper. Jake barely recognized his own kitchen. She'd scrubbed it within an inch of its life, organized his scattered supplies, and somehow transformed his meager stores into a meal that smelled like heaven. Fresh biscuits, beans seasoned with wild herbs she'd gathered, and even a pot of greens she'd found growing wild near the creek. "This is too much," Jake protested. "Your guests." "We're uninvited burdens," Margaret corrected firmly. "The least we can do is earn our keep. Sit, Mr. Sullivan. When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Jake couldn't rightly remember, which seemed answer enough for Margaret. She served with the efficiency of long practice, making sure everyone had plenty before taking her own portion. Watching the three sisters around his table, their quiet conversation and gentle teasing, Jake felt like an intruder in his own home, but not unpleasantly so. "You mentioned your father had a ranch," Jake ventured. "What happened to it?" The sisters exchanged glances. Margaret set down her fork carefully. "It was taken. Legally. Legal's a flexible word when the judge and the man wanting your land share whiskey every Saturday night," Rose said flatly. Jake knew that story too well. He'd seen it play out across the territory small ranchers pushed out by those with deeper pockets and fewer scruples. "Your father fought it, until he couldn't fight anymore," Catherine whispered. Another silence fell, heavy with unspoken truths. Jake didn't push. Everyone in the West carried shadows. Some just wore theirs more visibly than others. After supper, as Catherine lost herself in Charlotte Bronte's world and Margaret darned a tear in her skirt, Rose joined Jake on the porch. The evening was crisp, stars beginning to pierce the darkening sky. "We'll move on tomorrow," she said quietly. "We've no right to bring our troubles to your door." "Where would you go?" She shrugged. "West, California, maybe somewhere he can't reach. Running's no kind of life for women alone. Neither is staying and dying." Jake rolled a cigarette, taking his time. "This man chasing you, he have a name." Rose tensed. "Harrison Morrison. Owns half the county back home. Wants the other half. Our ranch sat on water rights he needs for his cattle empire." "And your father wouldn't sell?" "Would you if it was all you had to leave your daughters?" Jake thought of his own small spread, the sweat and blood that had gone into every fence post and building. "No, I wouldn't." "Then you understand." They sat in companionable silence, watching the first bats emerge for their evening hunt. From inside came the soft murmur of Margaret and Catherine talking, the honey-warm sound of women's voices filling spaces too long empty. "We're grateful, Mr. Sullivan," Rose said eventually, "for everything." but we won't have your death on our conscience. Morrison's men, they're not kind." "Neither am I," Jake said mildly. "Not when pushed." Rose studied his profile in the gathering darkness. "You were a lawman once, or military. Texas Rangers, before your wife. Before." She stood to go inside, pausing at the door. "You're a good man, Jake Sullivan. The world needs more like you." "World needs people willing to stand their ground," Jake corrected. "Seems to me you three have been doing that longer than most." Rose's smile was sad and knowing. "Standing your ground only works when you have ground to stand on." As night settled over the ranch, Jake made his rounds, checking locks and livestock with extra care. The sisters had retired to the bunkhouse, but light still gleamed through the windows. He could see their silhouettes moving about, probably planning their next move. Jake leaned against the barn door, looking up at the vast Wyoming sky. Somewhere out there, Harrison Morrison was looking for these women. Men like Morrison didn't give up easy, not when pride and greed were at stake. The smart play was to send the sisters on their way at first light, before trouble found his door. But Jake had been smart for 3 years. And what had it gotten him? An empty house and a silence so complete it rang in his ears. Maybe it was time to be something other than smart. "Think you can handle us all?" Rose had asked. Challenge and hope mingled in her voice. Standing there, under the stars, Jake Sullivan made his decision. Come morning, he'd teach them to shoot proper. If trouble was coming, they'd face it together. After all, some things were worth the risk. The night wrapped around Jake's ranch like a thick blanket, broken only by the occasional cry of a coyote and the restless stirring of horses. Jake couldn't sleep, his mind turning over the decision he'd made. Around midnight, he rose and walked to the window, noting the bunkhouse had finally gone dark. But as he watched, he caught movement near the barn quick, furtive shadows that didn't belong. Jake pulled on his boots and grabbed his Winchester, moving silent as smoke through his own door. The moon was new, offering little light, but years of night watches had taught him to read darkness like others read books. He circled wide, coming up behind the barn where he could hear voices, the sisters, speaking in urgent whispers. "I can't stay here, Margaret. You see how he looks at us. He knows we're lying. Where else can we go? Rose Catherine's exhausted, and the horses need rest. Better tired than dead. Morrison's men won't stop. You know what happened to Mama when she tried to fight him?" Jake's blood chilled at the pain in Rose's voice. He stepped closer, a twig cracking under his boot. The voices stopped instantly. "It's me," Jake called softly. "Jake Sullivan. I'm coming around." He found them huddled in the barn's shadow, fully dressed as if ready to flee. Catherine clutched a small bundle to her chest, her face pale in the starlight. Margaret's hand was on what looked like an old Navy Colt tucked in her waistband. Planning on leaving without saying goodbye, Jake kept his voice mild, non-threatening. "We have no right to endanger you," Margaret said firmly. "This isn't your fight." "Maybe not," Jake agreed, settling against the barn wall. "But seems to me you're having this conversation in my barn, which makes it at least partly my business. Now, you want to tell me what really happened with Morrison might help to know what we're facing." The sisters exchanged glances. Finally, Rose spoke, her voice flat and emotionless. "Harrison Morrison wanted our ranch. When Papa refused to sell, Morrison tried other methods. He came calling when Papa was away at market. Mama was alone with us." Jake's jaw tightened, already knowing where this was headed. "She fought," Catherine whispered, speaking for the first time. Mama was strong. She hit him with the fire poker, knocked him cold, but his men were outside. "They beat her," Margaret continued, her voice steady but her hands clenched. "Beat her until she couldn't stand. She lived 3 days, long enough to make us promise we'd never let Morrison win." "Your father tried to get justice through the law." Rose laughed bitterly. The judge said Mama must have fallen. Accidents happen on ranches. When Papa kept pushing, he had an accident too. Wagon wheel came loose on the way back from town, broke his neck in the fall. Jake felt the familiar burn of rage in his gut. He'd seen too much of this kind of justice in the territories. So you ran. We tried to stay, Margaret said. Tried to work the ranch ourselves, but Morrison's men came every night, shooting windows, killing stock, leaving threats nailed to our door. When they set fire to the barn with our milk cow inside. Her voice broke slightly. That's when we knew. Rose finished. Stay and die, or run and maybe live. How long ago? 3 months. We've been moving ever since, working where we could for food, sleeping rough, staying ahead of his trackers. Jake studied them in the darkness, 3 women driven from their home, haunted by violence and loss, still standing despite everything thrown at them. You walked into my barn last night, he said finally. From that moment, your fight became mine. That's how I was raised, and that's how my Mary would want it. Mr. Sullivan, Margaret began. Jake, he corrected. And I'm not finished. Come morning, we start preparing. You know how to shoot, but I'll wager you could use practice. We'll turn this place into something Morrison's men will think twice about attacking. Rose stepped closer, and in the darkness, he could just make out her fierce expression. Think you can handle us all? She asked again, but this time the question carried different weight. This won't end easy. Morrison doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget. Neither do I, Jake said simply. They stood there a moment longer. Then Jake gestured toward the bunkhouse. Get some rest, real rest. Nobody's riding anywhere tonight except over my dead body, and I'm not planning on dying anytime soon. As the sisters reluctantly returned to their quarters, Jake resumed his watch, but now he wasn't watching alone. He was protecting something again, had a purpose beyond mere survival. It felt like waking from a long sleep. Dawn came slowly, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Jake was at the stove making coffee when he heard footsteps on the porch. Rose appeared, her hair braided tight, wearing a split skirt more suitable for work than the torn dress from before. Borrowed it from your tack room, she said, noting his glance. Hope you don't mind. It was Mary's riding outfit. She'd approve. Rose poured herself coffee, standing close enough that Jake could smell the lavender soap she'd used. Tell me about her. Your wife. Jake rarely spoke of Mary, but something about the quiet morning and Rose's genuine interest loosened his tongue. She was a school teacher in Amarillo when I met her, properly raised. Never should have looked twice at a rough ranger like me, but she did. Said she saw something in me worth saving. She was right. She usually was, except about the fever. Thought she could nurse it out of our boy, then out of herself. I begged her to let me fetch the doctor from town, but she said it was too far, too expensive. Jake's voice roughened. By the time I ignored her and went anyway, it was too late. Rose's hand briefly touched his arm. I'm sorry. Long time ago now. Grief doesn't measure time the way clocks do. Jake looked at her, really looked. Beneath the defiance and strength, he saw her own grief, raw and recent. No, it doesn't. The moment was broken by Margaret and Catherine emerging, ready for the day's work. After a quick breakfast, Jake led them to a flat area behind the house. First rule of gunfighting, he said, setting up targets made from old cans and boards. Most folks can't shoot worth a damn when they're scared. The one who stays calm lives. He demonstrated with his Colt. 6 shots, placing 6 cans dancing. The sisters were impressed but not intimidated. Margaret produced her Navy Colt, an old but well-maintained piece. Rose carried a newer Smith & Wesson, while Catherine somewhat sheepishly revealed a Derringer. Where did you get that? Margaret demanded. Papa gave it to me last Christmas, Catherine said defensively. He said a lady should have protection. Jake approved. Smart man, but that's a last-ditch weapon. Let's get you comfortable with something that has more reach." The morning passed in instruction and practice. Margaret was steady but slow, overthinking each shot. Catherine surprised them all with natural accuracy once she stopped flinching. But Rose was born to it. She handled Jake's spare Winchester like she'd carried one all her life, placing shots with instinctive grace. "You've done this before," Jake observed. "Papa taught us all, but I took to it. Used to hunt antelope for the table." Her smile was sharp. Morrison's men found that out the hard way when they came calling one night. Didn't expect a woman to shoot back. "Hit any winged one. Should have aimed center mass like you're teaching." By afternoon, Jake had them working on defensive positions. The ranch's layout wasn't ideal, but there were possibilities. The barn could be fortified. The house had good sight lines. And the rocky outcrop near the corral offered cover. "If they come," Jake explained, "they'll probably try to burn us out, so we need water barrels stationed, blankets ready for smothering flames. Catherine, your job would be reloading weapons and watching our backs. Margaret, you take the house windows. Rose, I'll be wherever the fighting's thickest," she interrupted. Jake smiled grimly. "I was going to say you'd take the barn loft, best field of fire." As they worked through scenarios, Jake found himself impressed again by their practical intelligence. These weren't helpless victims. They were survivors who'd been pushed to their limits but hadn't broken. Evening brought exhaustion but also satisfaction. They'd accomplished much, weapons cleaned and loaded, defensive positions mapped, supplies organized. More importantly, they'd begun working as a unit. During supper, another small miracle from Margaret's hands, they heard horses approaching. Everyone tensed, hands moving to weapons, but Jake recognized the rider outlined against the sunset. "It's Jim Garrett from the Double Bar Ranch," he said, but didn't relax entirely. Garrett was a gossip and might carry tales. The rider dismounted at a respectful distance, calling out, "Jake, you home!" "Come ahead, Jim." Garrett was a weathered cowhand in his 50s, honest but curious as a cat. His eyes widened at seeing the women. "Well now, didn't know you had company." "Jake." "My cousins from back east." Jake lied smoothly. "Came for a visit. Ladies, this is Jim Garrett. Jim, my cousins, Margaret, Rose, and Catherine." Garrett tipped his hat, clearly skeptical but too polite to challenge the obvious fiction. "Ladies, Jake, I actually came by to warn you. Strangers were in town yesterday asking questions. Rough-looking bunch, led by a man named Briggs. They're looking for 3 women, claim they're thieves who robbed their employer." Rose's hand tightened on her fork, but her expression didn't change. "That's so," Jake said casually. "What did folks tell him?" "Nothing much. You know how Willow Creek feels about outsiders throwing their weight around?" "But Jake..." Garrett glanced at the sisters, then back to Jake. "These men aren't cowboys. They're killers. Watch yourself." "Always do. Jim, thanks for the warning." After Garrett left, silence settled heavy over the table. Catherine pushed her food around her plate while Margaret stared at nothing. Rose met Jake's eyes directly. "We should leave tonight," she said. Before they what track you here, they will whether you stay or go. At least here we can prepare." Jake leaned back. "Unless you'd rather keep running forever." "It's not your fight," Margaret burst out. "You don't understand what Morrison's capable of." "I understand plenty." Jake cut her off. "I've known men like Morrison all my life. They take what they want because nobody stands up to them. Well, I'm standing." Rose was still watching him with those intense green eyes. "Why, really, why?" Jake considered his words carefully. "My Mary used to say every person gets moments in their life where they choose who they really are. This is mine. I choose to be the man who doesn't let Harrison Morrison win. Even if it kills you. We all die. Question is whether we die for something worthwhile." Rose stood abruptly and walked out onto the porch. Jake gave her a moment, then followed. He found her gripping the rail, knuckles white. "I watched him beat my mother," she said quietly. "Watched his men hold us back while he—" She screamed for us to run, to not look, but we couldn't move. Couldn't help. When it was over, when she was broken on the floor, Morrison straightened his coat and said, "This is what happens to those who defy me." Jake moved closer but didn't touch her. "I'm sorry. I swore on her grave I'd kill him, but all I've done is run. What kind of daughter does that make me?" "A living one," Jake said firmly, and that's what she wanted. Rose turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. "I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid." "Then stop. Make your stand here." "Think you can handle us all?" she whispered, the familiar question now carrying layers of meaning, their violence, their grief, their desperate hope. "I can try," Jake said honestly. "That's all any of us can do." Rose studied his face for a long moment, then did something unexpected. She kissed him quick, fierce, like everything else about her. Before Jake could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone with the memory of lavender and gunpowder. Inside, he found Margaret waiting. "She likes you," the eldest sister said simply. "But Jake, mister, Sullivan don't play with her feelings. She's been hurt enough." "I'm not playing at anything," Jake assured her. Margaret nodded slowly. "Then God help us all, because tomorrow, or the next day, Harrison Morrison's men will find us. And when they do, Jake finished, they'll find more than they bargained for. Now get some rest. Tomorrow we drill again." As the sisters returned to the bunkhouse, Jake began his nightly rounds, but this time, he wasn't just protecting property. He was protecting possibilities of justice, of redemption, of something more than mere survival. The stars wheeled overhead, silent witnesses to the drama unfolding below. Somewhere in the darkness, Morrison's men were coming. But here, now, Jake Sullivan had found something worth fighting for again. "Think you can handle us all?" Rose had asked. Standing guard in the Wyoming night, Jake knew his answer. He would handle whatever came, or die trying. The morning brought trouble in the form of dust clouds on the eastern horizon. Jake spotted them first from his vantage point on the roof, where he'd been reinforcing defensive positions. 6 riders, moving with the deliberate pace of men who expected no resistance. "Company," he called down to Rose, who was hauling water barrels into strategic positions. She shaded her eyes, studying the approaching riders. "That's Briggs in the lead, Morrison's top gun hand." Her voice was steady, but Jake saw her fingers tighten on the bucket handle. "Get your sisters. Remember what we discussed." Rose nodded and hurried to the house. Within minutes, the transformation was complete. Margaret emerged wearing one of Mary's old dresses, her hair pinned up like a proper rancher's wife. She took Jake's arm with practiced ease, playing the part. Catherine appeared in the doorway, an apron tied around her waist, humming softly as she worked at some mending. Rose had changed into a simple calico dress and was scattering feed to the chickens, the perfect picture of domestic tranquility. The riders approached the main gate, spreading out in a half-circle, a tactical formation that told Jake these men knew their business. Briggs was a tall man with dead eyes and a face carved from granite. His hand rested casual-like on his pistol butt. "Morning," Jake called out, keeping his tone friendly but not overly welcoming. "Something I can help you folks with." Briggs touched his hat brim mockingly. "Looking for some information? Friend. 3 women, traveling alone. Heard they might have passed through these parts." "Lots of folks pass through," Jake said non-committally. "What's your interest?" "They're thieves," another rider spoke up, a weasel-faced man with nervous eyes. "Stole from Mr. Harrison Morrison, our employer. We're deputized to bring them back for trial." Jake noted the lie, no badges visible, no official papers produced. Sorry, can't help you. Been here with my wife and her sister all week. Haven't seen any strangers. Margaret chose that moment to step forward, every inch the concerned ranch wife. Jacob, who are these men? She managed to inject just the right amount of wariness into her voice. Just some fellows looking for information, dear, Jake replied, playing along. Nothing to concern yourself with. Briggs' eyes raked over Margaret with an intensity that made Jake's trigger finger itch. Your wife, you say? 2 years come August, Margaret supplied, moving closer to Jake. Is there trouble? Should we be worried about these thieves? No trouble if folks mind their own business, Briggs said, his meaning clear. But harboring fugitives, that's a hanging offense in some parts. From the house came the sweet sound of Catherine's voice raised in song, a church hymn, pure and innocent. The incongruity of it against the mounting tension made several of the riders shift uncomfortably. My sister-in-law, Margaret explained. She's preparing for her wedding, practices every day. She looked directly at Briggs. We're God-fearing people here. Sir, if we see any thieves, we'll surely report them to the proper authorities in town. Briggs studied them for a long moment. Jake could see him weighing the situation, trying to reconcile the domestic scene with whatever information he'd gathered. Finally, he nodded slowly. Mind if we water our horses before we move on? It wasn't really a request. Jake gestured toward the trough near the barn, where Rose was still tending the chickens. As the men dismounted, she glanced up with practiced indifference, then went back to her chores. But Jake saw Briggs watching her, saw the moment of recognition flicker across his features. The weasel-faced rider had noticed too. He drifted closer to Rose, who continued scattering feed as if unaware. When he got within arm's reach, she turned with the bucket, accidentally catching him full in the chest with the remaining grain. Oh, I'm so sorry, she exclaimed, brushing at his vest with exaggerated concern. I didn't hear you approach. These chickens make such a racket. The man sputtered, grain in his beard, while his companions laughed. Even Briggs cracked a smile. Clumsy girl, the weasel-faced man growled. Now, Sims, Briggs said mildly. No harm done. The lady apologized. But Jake had seen the calculation in Briggs's eyes. He knew, maybe not for certain, but he suspected. The question was what he'd do about it. As the men prepared to leave, Briggs mounted his horse and looked directly at Jake. Interesting setup you have here. Friend, man living alone suddenly has a wife and her family. Convenient. Life takes funny turns, Jake replied evenly. Mary's family back east fell on hard times after her father died. What kind of man would I be if I didn't take them in? Indeed. Briggs touched his hat again. We'll be in the area for a while. Mr. Morrison is quite eager to recover his property. He's authorized a substantial reward, $500 for information leading to their capture. That's a lot of money, Jake acknowledged. Must have stolen something valuable. Oh, yes. Briggs smiled, and it was like watching a snake bare its fangs. Very valuable to Mr. Morrison. He takes such things personally. After the riders left, the four of them maintained their charade until the dust clouds disappeared over the horizon. Only then did Margaret sink onto the porch step, hands trembling. He knew, she whispered. That man knew. Maybe, Jake agreed. But knowing and proving are different things. You all did well. Catherine appeared in the doorway, still clutching her mending. I thought I was going to faint when that horrible little man got close to Rose. You kept singing, Rose pointed out. That was brilliant. Nothing says innocent household like hymns from the parlor. But Jake wasn't celebrating. He'd seen men like Briggs before patient hunters who'd circle back when least expected. They'll be back, probably at night. We need to be ready. They spent the afternoon fortifying their positions. Jake showed them how to stack grain sacks for cover, where to position water barrels for firefighting, how to move between buildings without exposing themselves to gunfire. The sisters absorbed it all with grim determination. As evening approached, Margaret prepared a cold supper, nothing that required lingering in the exposed kitchen. They ate quietly, weapons close at hand, listening to every sound the prairie night offered. "I've been thinking," Catherine said suddenly, "if we survive this." "When?" Rose corrected firmly. "When we survive this." Catherine smiled slightly. "When we survive this, what then? We can't go home. Morrison owns everything now." "We start over," Margaret said simply. "Find somewhere new, maybe California like Rose suggested." "Together?" Catherine asked. And Jake heard the fear beneath the question, fear of being alone, of losing the only family she had left. "Always together," Margaret assured her. Jake cleared his throat. "Plenty of land out here needs working, good water, decent grass. A family could make a go of it, with the right help." The words hung in the air. An offer and a question rolled into one. Rose met his eyes across the table, something unreadable in her expression. "That's a kind thought, Mr. Sullivan," Margaret said carefully. "But we wouldn't want to impose—" She was cut off by the sound of approaching horses. Many horses, moving fast. Jake blew out the lamp and moved to the window. In the moonlight, he counted at least a dozen riders spreading out to surround the property. "Positions," he said quietly. "Remember, stay calm. Pick your targets. Make every shot count." Margaret took the east window with her Navy Colt and Jake's spare rifle. Catherine positioned herself in the central hallway with ammunition and medical supplies. Rose grabbed the Winchester and headed for the ladder to the loft. "Rose," Jake called softly. She paused, looking back. "Whatever happens, save it for after," she said. But her fierce smile took the sting from the words. "We've got work to do." Jake took position at the front window, watching the riders form a loose circle around the buildings. Briggs's voice carried clearly in the still air. "Sullivan, we know you've got them in there. Send them out, and we'll ride away peaceful-like. No harm will come to you." "Can't send out what I don't have. Briggs," Jake called back. "Just me and my family here." "Now that's disappointing." Briggs replied, "Mr. Morrison hoped we could do this civilized, but he's prepared for other alternatives." Jake saw the torches being lit and cursed under his breath. Fire was always the worst threat on the prairie. "You burn this place, you'll answer to the law." Briggs laughed. "What law? The nearest marshal is 3 days' ride. And Judge Morrison, excuse me, Judge Watson is Mr. Morrison's cousin. Who exactly is going to arrest us?" A shot rang out from the loft, Rose's Winchester speaking. A rider yelped and dropped his torch, clutching his shoulder. "That's one warning," her voice carried down. "Next one goes center mass." The response was immediate. Gunfire erupted from all sides, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness like deadly fireflies. Jake returned fire methodically. Saw one man topple from his saddle. Margaret's rifle cracked steadily from the other window. "The barn!" Catherine cried out, pointing to where flames were beginning to lick at the structure. Jake made a quick decision. "Catherine, stay down. Margaret, cover me." He burst from the door, running in a crouch toward the water barrels. Bullets whined past like angry hornets, but Margaret and Rose laid down covering fire. Jake grabbed a bucket, dousing the flames before they could take hold. A rider charged him, pistol raised. Jake dropped the bucket and drew, firing from the hip. The man tumbled backward off his horse. More torches arced through the air. One crashed through the kitchen window, spreading fire across Mary's clean floor. Catherine appeared with a blanket, smothering the flames while bullets shattered the remaining glass above her head. "Fall back to the house," Jake ordered. The barn was too exposed, too vulnerable. They consolidated their position, turning the house into a fortress. Rose abandoned the loft, sliding down the ladder as flames began to engulf the barn roof. The loss of the high ground was a blow, but at least they were together. The battle raged on. Jake lost track of time, measured moments only in muzzle flashes and the steady crack of rifles. His ammunition ran low, then lower. Margaret's Navy Colt clicked empty, and she switched to the shotgun Jake had loaded with buckshot, just when it seemed they'd be overwhelmed. New gunfire erupted from beyond the circle of attackers. Riders scattered in confusion as fresh combatants entered the fray. Jake recognized Jim Garrett's voice raised in a rebel yell, followed by others' neighbors from surrounding ranches, drawn by the smoke and gunfire. Briggs' men, caught between two forces, began to retreat. Several lay still on the ground. Others rode hard for the horizon. Briggs himself tried to rally them, but a shot from Rose's Winchester knocked his hat from his head and convinced him to join the retreat. As quickly as it had begun, the battle ended. Jake emerged cautiously, rifle at ready, to find Garrett and half a dozen other ranchers spreading out to secure the area. "Heard the commotion," Garrett explained, somewhat shamefaced. "Took us a while to gather everyone, but we don't hold with hired guns terrorizing folks in our valley." Margaret appeared at Jake's side, soot-streaked but steady. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett, all of you." Old Sam Wheeler, who ran the general store in town, surveyed the damage. "Jake, what's this really about? Those weren't ordinary rustlers." Jake made a decision. These men had risked their lives. They deserved the truth. "These ladies are the rightful heirs to a ranch stolen by Harrison Morrison. He murdered their parents and has been hunting them ever since. I gave them shelter, and I'll keep giving it as long as they need." The ranchers exchanged glances. They all knew the type of man Morrison was. The territories were full of such petty tyrants. "Well then," Wheeler said finally, "seems to me we need to have a talk with Judge Watson about jurisdiction. Last I checked, murder warrants don't stop at county lines." As the neighbors helped fight the remaining fires and tend the wounded attackers, Jake found himself alone with Rose beside the smoldering barn. Her face was streaked with powder burns and tears, but her eyes blazed with triumph. "Think you can handle us all?" she asked one more time. And this time, Jake heard all the questions within the question. Could he handle their past, their pain, their uncertain future? Could he handle the danger they brought, the changes they'd make to his ordered life? Could he handle the possibility of loss again? Jake looked at his burning barn, his bullet-riddled house, then at the woman beside him, fierce and beautiful and absolutely worth any price. "I can handle whatever comes," he said simply. "Question is, can you handle staying—" Rose's smile was answer enough. Behind them, Margaret and Catherine emerged from the house, joining them in watching the flames die down. They'd survived the first test, but Jake knew this was far from over. Morrison wouldn't give up easily, not with his pride at stake. But standing there with these three remarkable women, backed by neighbors who'd proven their worth, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years' hope. The war wasn't won, but the first battle was theirs. And tomorrow, they'd start rebuilding not just the barn, but a life worth fighting for. The acrid smell of smoke still hung in the air 3 nights later when they came again. This time there was no warning. No circling riders in the moonlight, just the sudden crash of the door being kicked in and dark shapes pouring into the house. Jake rolled from his bed, grabbing for his pistol, but they were already on him. A rifle butt caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. He fought back with fists and fury, hearing Margaret scream from the next room, the crash of furniture overturning. "Get the women, Morrison wants them alive." Briggs' voice cut through the chaos. Jake struggled to his feet, throwing a wild punch that connected with someone's jaw. A gunshot exploded near his ear, deafening him momentarily. Through the ringing, he heard Rose's Winchester bark once, twice, then the sound of a struggle. "Jake!" Catherine's terrified cry spurred him to greater effort. He broke free from his attackers, stumbled toward her voice, only to be brought down by a tackle from behind. The fight was brutal but brief. Outnumbered and surprised, they were overwhelmed. Jake found himself on his knees, blood running from a cut above his eye, hands tied behind his back. The sisters were similarly bound, forced to kneel in a line before Briggs. "Well now," Briggs said conversationally, lighting a lamp. "That was more trouble than necessary. 2 of my men dead, another likely dying mister. Morrison won't be pleased about that." Rose spat blood, having taken a blow to the mouth during her capture. "Morrison can go to hell, and you with him." Briggs backhanded her casually, knocking her sideways. Jake surged against his bonds, earning himself another rifle butt to the ribs. "Enough," a new voice commanded from the doorway. "There's been quite enough violence for one evening." Harrison Morrison stepped into the lamplight, and Jake got his first look at the man who'd caused so much pain. He was younger than expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of handsomeness that came from good breeding and better grooming. His clothes were immaculate despite the late hour and rough ride, but his eyes were as cold and dead as a snake's. "Ladies," Morrison said pleasantly, as if greeting them at a social function. "You've led me quite a chase. I must admit, I'm impressed and disappointed. All this could have been avoided if your father had simply been reasonable." "Reasonable?" Margaret's voice shook with rage. "You killed our mother. You murdered him." Morrison tisked softly. "Your mother's death was regrettable. I lost my temper. It happens. As for your father, well, accidents do happen on these frontier roads. Tragic, really." He turned his attention to Jake. "And you must be the gallant Mr. Sullivan, the man who thought he could harbor fugitives from justice." "I see no fugitives," Jake said steadily. "Just 3 women defending themselves against a murderer." Morrison's pleasant mask slipped for a moment, revealing something ugly beneath. "Careful, Mr. Sullivan. You're already guilty of interference with legal recovery of property. Don't add slander to your crimes." "Property," Rose laughed bitterly. "Is that what we are to you?" "In a manner of speaking." Morrison began pulling on leather gloves with precise movements. "You see, your father owed me a substantial debt. With him gone, that debt passes to his heirs. You can work it off in my employ, or—" He shrugged elegantly. "Or what?" Catherine whispered. Morrison's smile was terrible. "Why, there are always alternatives. The mining camps are full of men hungry for female companionship. I'm sure we could come to some arrangement." Jake felt the sisters stiffen beside him, understood the full horror of Morrison's threat. "You son of a—" The blow from Briggs cut him off mid-curse. Morrison tutted disapprovingly. "Language, Mr. Sullivan. There are ladies present." He moved closer to the sisters, studying them like a rancher evaluating stock. "Yes, I think we'll start the journey back tonight. The sooner we resolve this unpleasant business, the better." "You can't," Catherine burst out. "Please, we'll sign over the ranch. Everything. Just let us go." "Oh, my dear child," Morrison said softly. Reaching out to touch her face, she flinched away. "It's far too late for that. You see, this isn't about land anymore. It's about respect, authority. What message would it send if I allowed 3 girls to defy me publicly and simply walk away?" He straightened. Addressing Briggs, "Prepare the horses. We leave within the hour. And Mr. Sullivan—" He paused dramatically. "I'm afraid we can't leave witnesses." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jake met Rose's eyes, saw his own desperation reflected there. If they were taken now, it was over. Morrison would never let them testify against him, never let them go free. They'd disappear into the vast frontier, 3 more casualties of a lawless land. "Think you can handle us all?" Rose asked suddenly, looking directly at Jake. But this time the familiar question carried a different meaning, a signal, a reminder of all their preparations. Jake understood. When Catherine had been positioned as keeper of ammunition during their drills, he'd also taught her another trick, a small knife concealed in her boot. Insurance against exactly this situation? The question was whether she remembered, whether she had the nerve to use it. "I can handle whatever needs handling," Jake replied carefully, shifting position slightly to give Catherine better access to his bonds. Morrison laughed. How touching. The hero maintaining his courage to the end. "Briggs, take him outside. No need to make a mess in the house." As Briggs hauled Jake to his feet, Catherine stumbled, falling against him. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and he felt the slight pressure of steel against the ropes binding his wrists. The girl had nerve after all. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars wheeling overhead in cosmic indifference to human suffering. Briggs shoved Jake toward the corral fence, drawing his pistol. "Nothing personal. Sullivan," Briggs said. "You seem a decent sort. Wrong place, wrong time." "Story of my life," Jake agreed, working frantically at the loosened bonds. The knife had given him hope, but not freedom, not yet. From inside the house came a sudden crash, followed by shouting. Briggs turned instinctively toward the sound, and Jake made his move. The ropes gave way just as he launched himself at the gunman. They went down hard, rolling in the dirt, fighting for control of the weapon. The gun went off, the shot echoing across the prairie. Jake felt the burn of powder against his cheek, but no impact. He drove his knee into Briggs's stomach, grabbed for the gun. They rolled again, and this time Jake came up on top. He smashed Briggs's gun hand against a rock once, twice, until the weapon fell free. Briggs was tough, fighting back with knees and elbows, but Jake had desperation on his side. He got his hands around the man's throat, bearing down with all his weight. Briggs clawed at him, eyes bulging, then finally went limp. Jake grabbed the fallen pistol and ran for the house. Inside was chaos. The sisters had somehow broken free. Catherine's hidden knife had done its work. Margaret wielded a chair like a club, holding two men at bay. Rose had reclaimed her Winchester and put one attacker down, working the lever to chamber another round. Morrison stood near the door, pistol drawn but seeming unsure where to aim first. He spotted Jake and swung toward him, but Jake was already moving. He dove sideways, firing as he went. Morrison cursed, clutching his shoulder as his weapon clattered away. "It's over! Morrison!" Jake shouted. "Your men are down or gone!" But Morrison wasn't finished. With his good arm, he grabbed Catherine, who'd been creeping toward her sisters. A knife appeared in his hand, a wicked skinning blade pressed against her throat. "Everyone stop," he commanded. "Drop your weapons or I open her throat." The room froze. Rose held her rifle steady, but Jake could see the anguish in her eyes. Margaret lowered her chair slowly. Jake kept his pistol raised but didn't dare shoot, not with Catherine's life in the balance. "That's better," Morrison panted. Blood seeped between his fingers where he clutched his wounded shoulder. "Now we're going to walk out of here. The girl comes with me as insurance. Anyone follows, she dies." "Let her go," Margaret pleaded. "Take me instead. I'm the eldest, the one who inherits. She's just a child." "A child who shot at me," Morrison snarled. "No, she'll do nicely." He began backing toward the door, dragging Catherine with him. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she stayed still, smart enough not to struggle with a blade at her throat. Jake's mind raced, searching for options, finding none. Then Catherine did something unexpected. She began to sing the same hymn she'd sung when Briggs first visited. Her voice was thin with fear, but pure, the notes rising in the blood-scented air like a prayer. Morrison paused, perhaps surprised by this show of courage or faith. It was only a second's hesitation, but it was enough. Rose's Winchester cracked once. Morrison's knife hand jerked away from Catherine's throat as the bullet took him high in the chest. He staggered back, eyes wide with shock, then crumpled to the floor. Catherine ran to her sisters, all three embracing fiercely. Jake moved to Morrison, kicking the knife away and checking for signs of life. The man's eyes were already glazing. blood bubbling from his lips. "Think, you've won," Morrison gasped. "I have friends, powerful friends. They'll—" Whatever threat he meant to make died with him. Jake stood slowly, suddenly feeling every blow he'd taken. Around them, the house looked like a battlefield furniture overturned. Blood on the floors, bodies scattered about. Some Morrison's men groaned and stirred. Others would never move again. "It's done," Jake said quietly. "He's dead. It's over." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Morrison had spoken of friends, connections. There would be questions, investigations, possibly charges to face. They'd won the battle, but the war might continue in courtrooms and legal documents. Rose moved to his side, her face pale but determined. "Think you can handle what comes next?" she asked. And this time there was no challenge in it, just a genuine question about their future. Jake looked at the three sisters, bloodied but unbroken. Having faced their tormentor and survived, he thought of the ranch waiting to be rebuilt, the legal battles ahead, the challenge of making a life together from the ashes of violence. "Together," he asked. "I can handle anything." Margaret joined them, placing a hand on Jake's arm. "We'll testify to what happened here. Self-defense, all of it. And we have Catherine's journal. She documented everything Morrison did to our family." "Journal?" Jake asked. Catherine nodded, moving to a loose floorboard and prying it up. From beneath, she produced a leather-bound book. "Everything's in here. Dates, witnesses, his own words when he came to threaten us. I thought someday someone might listen." Jake felt a surge of hope. With documentation and testimony, they might not just survive the legal challenges, they might actually see justice done. Dawn was breaking by the time they'd secured the surviving attackers and tended their own wounds. Jake found Rose on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I didn't think I'd live to see another dawn." Jake stood beside her, close enough to feel her warmth. "Many more to come. We'll rebuild the barn, expand the house, make it a real home." Rose looked up at him, and for the first time since they'd met, her smile held no shadows. "A home. I like the sound of that." From inside came Margaret's voice, already organizing the cleanup with her usual efficiency, and Catherine's lighter tones as she tended to the wounded. It wouldn't be easy, there would be challenges ahead, legal and otherwise, but standing there in the new dawn, Jake knew they'd face them as they had everything else together. "Think you can handle us all?" Rose asked one last time, but now it was purely teasing, affectionate. Jake pulled her close, feeling her melt against him. "Already am," he said simply. "Already am." The sun climbed higher, burning away the shadows of night, promising a new beginning for those brave enough to seize it. And on Jake Sullivan's ranch, 4 souls who'd found each other in violence and pain began the slow, sweet work of building something better from the ashes of their past. The dust cloud on the horizon was massive, far larger than anything they'd seen before. Jake counted at least 40 riders, maybe more, approaching in military precision. At their head rode Harrison Morrison himself, very much alive despite the man who died in Jake's house 3 days prior that had been his brother. Samuel Morrison, acting in Harrison's stead. "Dear God," Margaret breathed from beside Jake. "He's brought an army." They stood on the porch, watching destiny approach. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of preparation and revelations. The man Rose had shot wasn't Harrison Morrison, but his younger brother, sent to do the dirty work while Harrison maintained plausible deniability. Now the real Morrison was coming, and he'd brought enough guns to level the entire ranch. Judge Watson rode beside Morrison, his black coat and severe expression lending an air of terrible legitimacy to the proceedings. Jake recognized several badge-wearing men among the riders bought lawmen from neighboring counties, giving Morrison's vendetta the color of law. "Positions," Jake said quietly. but Rose placed a hand on his arm. "No, not this time. We can't fight that many." Her green eyes were steady, resigned. "He wins." "We're not giving up," Jake said firmly. "Not after everything." "Look closer," Margaret said softly. "Behind Morrison's men." Jake squinted against the morning sun and felt his heart lift. Another group of riders followed at a distance: Jim Garrett, Sam Wheeler, and what looked like half the honest folk from 3 counties around. They weren't interfering. Not yet, but their presence sent a clear message: we're watching. Morrison's force stopped just beyond rifle range. The man himself rode forward with Judge Watson and 6 guards, close enough to talk, but not close enough for anyone to try anything desperate. In the daylight, Harrison Morrison was an older, harder version of his dead brother's steel-gray hair, sharp features, and eyes like winter ice. "Mr. Sullivan," Morrison called out, his voice carrying clearly. "I understand you murdered my brother Samuel 3 nights ago." "Your brother died attacking my home," Jake replied evenly. 5 witnesses will testify to that." "Bought witnesses," Judge Watson interjected. "Conspirators in theft and murder, their testimony is worthless." Morrison held up a sheaf of papers. "I have here warrants for the arrest of Margaret, Rose, and Catherine Williams on charges of theft, arson, and now murder. They will return with me to stand trial." "In your cousin's court," Jake laughed bitterly. "That's not justice. Morrison, that's a lynching with legal decorations." Morrison's mask of civility slipped. "They killed my brother." "Your brother died trying to kidnap 3 women at knife point," Jake shot back. "Just like their mother died resisting your advances. How many have to die for your pride?" Morrison. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Jake saw several of the deputized lawmen shift uncomfortably. Whatever Morrison had told them, it likely hadn't included the full truth. "Careful with your accusations, Sullivan," Morrison said coldly. "Slander is also a crime." Catherine suddenly stepped forward, her journal clutched in her hands. Her voice shook but carried clearly. "It's not slander if it's true. I have here a record of everything: dates, times, witnesses. How you came to our ranch when Papa was gone, how Mama fought you, how she died 3 days later from her injuries." The ravings of a grief-stricken child. Judge Watson dismissed. "Inadmissible." "Then let's make it admissible," a new voice called out. The crowd of onlookers parted to reveal a man that Jake didn't recognize: elderly, dignified, wearing the kind of suit that spoke of city law offices rather than frontier justice. "Judge Clarence Hartwell, Federal Circuit Court. I received some very interesting telegrams about the situation here." Morrison's face went pale. "Judge Hartwell, I wasn't aware the federal court had any interest in a local matter. Murder crosses county lines, Mr. Morrison, as does corruption of local judiciary." Hartwell rode closer, his keen eyes taking in the scene. "Judge Watson, I'll be reviewing your recent decisions. I suggest you distance yourself from this matter immediately." Watson spluttered, but Hartwell wasn't finished. "As for you, Mr. Morrison, I've been investigating your land acquisitions for some time. The Williams Ranch is just the latest in a pattern of suspicious deaths and forced sales. I think it's time we had a proper trial in my court, with a jury drawn from outside your sphere of influence." "This is outrageous." Morrison's composure cracked completely. "These women are thieves and murderers. They killed my brother." "Then present your evidence in court," Hartwell said mildly. "If your case is as strong as you claim, you have nothing to fear from impartial justice." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, and suddenly the air crackled with tension. Jake's hand found his own weapon, as did Rose and the sisters. The deputized lawmen looked uncertain, caught between their bought loyalty and the presence of a federal judge. "I wouldn't," Jim Garrett called out, riding forward with the townspeople. "Judge Hartwell didn't come alone. Federal marshals are already in town. waiting for his word. You pull that trigger, Morrison, and you'll hang for certain. Morrison's face contorted with rage, but he slowly moved his hand away from his weapon. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I'll have the best lawyers money can buy. I'll see those girls hang and you with them. Sullivan." "You're welcome to try," Jake said steadily. "But you'll do it in a court of law, not with hired guns in the dead of night." Judge Hartwell produced a document from his coat. "Mr. Natir Morrison, you're hereby served with notice to appear in federal court to answer charges of conspiracy, corruption, and murder. You may surrender yourself voluntarily or be taken into custody." For a moment, Jake thought Morrison might actually try to fight. His men outnumbered everyone else, and desperation could drive a man to madness. But then he saw the doubt in the hired guns' faces, the way the deputized lawmen were already backing away. Federal judge, federal marshals, this had gotten bigger than a local land grab, and smart men knew when to cut their losses. "You'll regret this," Morrison said finally, his voice low and venomous. "All of you. I have friends, influence. This judge won't protect you forever." "He doesn't have to," Rose spoke up, her Winchester cradled casually in her arms. "We protect ourselves, and each other. That's something you'll never understand. Morrison, you take what you want because you can. We defend what we love because we must." Morrison's eyes fixed on her with pure hatred. "Your mother said something similar. Right before—" The crack of Rose's rifle cut him off. The bullet whined past Morrison's ear, close enough to draw blood. "The next one goes center mass," she said calmly. "Keep talking about my mother, please." "Rose," Judge Hartwell warned, though Jake heard sympathy in his tone. "Self-defense," Rose said, not lowering the rifle. "He was threatening me. Dozens of witnesses heard it." Morrison touched his bleeding ear, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. No one had stood up to him like this, certainly not a woman. He wheeled his horse around without another word, spurring it back toward his men. After a moment's confusion, they followed, the army that had seemed so invincible suddenly retreating in disarray. Judge Watson tried to maintain his dignity as he followed, but Jake heard Hartwell call after him, "Judge Watson, my office, tomorrow morning. Bring your law books, you'll need to refresh your memory on judicial ethics." As the dust settled, the townspeople surged forward. Jake found himself shaking hands, accepting congratulations. But his eyes sought the sisters. Margaret stood tall and proud, the weight of weeks of fear finally lifting from her shoulders. Catherine clutched her journal like a talisman, tears streaming down her face, and Rose stood apart, still watching the horizon where Morrison had disappeared. Jake went to her. "It's over," he said gently. "He'll face trial, with Catherine's journal and Judge Hartwell overseeing. He'll finally answer for what he's done." "Is it?" Rose asked. "He's rich, connected. What if he buys his way free?" "Then we'll deal with that when it comes," Jake said. "But for now, today, you won. You stood up to him and won." Judge Hartwell approached, tipping his hat to the ladies. "Miss Williams, all of you, I'll need to take your statements. That journal will be crucial evidence. But I want you to know, the federal government takes a dim view of men who use violence to steal land. Your parents will have justice." "Thank you," Margaret said simply, though Jake could see the emotion she held back. We'd given up hope that anyone would listen. "Sometimes it takes a while for the right ears to hear," Hartwell said. "Mr. Sullivan, I understand you've offered these ladies protection." "I have, for as long as they need it." Hartwell smiled. "Good man. They'll need a stable residence during the trial. I trust you'll see they make it to court when required." "You have my word." As Hartwell departed to organize the legal proceedings, the sisters found themselves surrounded by well-wishers. Women who'd been too afraid to speak up now shared their own stories of Morrison's cruelty. Men who'd lost land or livestock promised to testify. The tide had turned, and everyone could feel it. That evening, as they sat around Jake's kitchen table scarred by violence, but still standing, a sense of unreality settled over them. After so much fear and fighting, the sudden arrival of justice seemed almost too good to be true. "What happens now?" Catherine asked, voicing what they all wondered. "Now we rebuild." Jake said, "Fix the barn, repair the house, get ready for whatever comes next." "Together?" Margaret asked, and Jake heard the uncertainty beneath the question. With Morrison facing trial, the sisters didn't technically need his protection anymore. They could go anywhere, start fresh somewhere Morrison's shadow had never fallen. Jake looked at each of them, Margaret with her quiet strength, Catherine with her gentle courage, and Rose with her fierce spirit. They'd crashed into his life in a storm and turned everything upside down. His quiet, ordered existence was gone forever, replaced by something chaotic and challenging and absolutely worth fighting for. "Together," he confirmed. "If you'll have me." Rose's smile was answer enough. "Think you can handle us all?" she asked, the familiar refrain now warm with affection and promise. "Already told you," Jake said, reaching for her hand. "I can handle anything with you three beside me." Outside, night fell over the Wyoming prairie, but inside the house, lamp-lit warmth held the darkness at bay. They had survived Morrison's worst, found unexpected allies, and discovered something worth building together. The legal battles ahead would be challenging, but they'd face them as they had everything else united, determined and unbreakable. The war wasn't over, but for tonight, they'd won something precious, the right to hope for tomorrow. The attack came at dawn, 2 days after Judge Hartwell's visit. Harrison Morrison had gathered every hired gun, every desperate man, every favor owed from across 3 territories. They came like a plague of locusts, over 50 riders descending on Jake's ranch with murderous intent. Jake woke to thunder that wasn't thunder, the pounding of hooves shaking the earth. He grabbed his Winchester and rushed to the window, his heart sinking at the sight. This wasn't a raid, it was an invasion. "Everyone up," he shouted. "They're coming." The sisters responded instantly, trained by weeks of danger. Margaret took her position at the east window. Rose headed for the reinforced corner they designated as their stronghold, and Catherine began distributing ammunition with steady hands despite the fear in her eyes. "Too many," Margaret said grimly, counting muzzle flashes as the first shots rang out. "We can't hold against this." She was right. Jake had faced long odds before, but this was suicide. Morrison had learned from his previous failures no small probing attacks, no attempts at negotiation. He meant to overwhelm them with sheer numbers. "The root cellar," Jake decided quickly. "We fall back to—" The front door exploded inward, kicked open by a giant of a man Jake recognized as Bull Watson, the judge's cousin and Morrison's chief enforcer. Jake fired from the hip, the Winchester bucking against his ribs. Bull stumbled but didn't fall. The man wore a steel vest under his coat. Rose's rifle cracked from across the room. Finding the gap at Bull's throat, he went down gurgling. But more men poured through the doorway. The house became a battleground. Furniture shattering under gunfire, plaster dust filling the air like fog. "Kitchen," Jake ordered, laying down covering fire as they retreated. They'd prepared for the supplies cached, weapons loaded, escape routes planned. But planning and execution were different things when bullets filled the air like angry hornets. Catherine cried out, clutching her arm where a bullet had grazed her. Margaret dragged her behind the overturned table, while Rose and Jake held the doorway. Bodies piled up in the narrow passage, but more kept coming. "We're being flanked," Margaret shouted, firing through the kitchen window at riders circling the house. Jake's ammunition ran low, then empty. He drew his Colt, making each shot count, but they were being pressed from all sides. Smoke began to fill the room Morrison's men had fired the barn, and the flames were spreading. Just when it seemed they'd be overwhelmed, new gunfire erupted from outside. Not the wild shooting of Morrison's hired guns, but disciplined volleys. Through the shattered window, Jake saw uniformed riders, federal marshals, just as Garrett had promised, but also something more. Blue uniforms, cavalry.
The army rose, gasped between shots.
A bugle call split the morning air, followed by a disciplined charge that scattered Morrison's men like leaves before a hurricane. Jake recognized the officer leading them, Captain Michael O'Brien, an old friend from his ranger days, now commanding Fort Laramie's cavalry detachment. Morrison's hired guns, brave enough when facing outnumbered civilians, broke entirely when faced with trained soldiers. Some fled immediately, spurring their horses toward the horizon. Others tried to fight and were cut down with military efficiency. Within minutes, the tide had turned completely.
"Jake Sullivan,"
O'Brien's voice boomed from outside.
"You still alive in there? You ornery cuss."
"Still kicking, Mike," Jake called back. "Though your timing could have been better." They emerged cautiously from the bullet-riddled house to find Morrison's force in complete disarray. Federal marshals were rounding up surrendering gunmen while cavalry troopers established a perimeter. And there, in the middle of it all, sat Harrison Morrison on his horse, face twisted with incomprehension at how his certain victory had become disaster. Sheriff Thompson from town was there too, backed by a legitimate posse. "Morrison," he called out, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and about 30 other charges I'll think of by the time we reach jail." Morrison's eyes found Jake and the sisters, hatred burning in their depths.
"This isn't over,"
he snarled. "Money talks louder than law. I'll be free within a week, and then—" Catherine stepped forward, surprising everyone. Quiet Catherine, the youngest, the gentlest, raised her father's old pistol with rock-steady hands. "You killed my mother," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "You destroyed my father. You've hunted us like animals." "Catherine," Margaret warned. But the girl didn't waver.
"I should kill you,"
Catherine continued. "It would be justice, real justice, not whatever theater the courts will provide." The hammer clicked back on the old pistol.
"One shot, and my family rests easy."
Morrison, for the first time Jake had seen, looked genuinely afraid. This slip of a girl, barely 19, had him staring down the barrel of his own mortality. "But I won't," Catherine said finally, lowering the weapon. "Because unlike you, we're not murderers. We're survivors. And we'll watch you hang legally, properly, with all the ceremony your victims never got." Sheriff Thompson moved in then, pulling Morrison roughly from his horse. The man who'd terrorized a county suddenly looked small, old, diminished without his army of thugs. As the marshals led Morrison away in irons, Captain O'Brien approached Jake with a grin. "Got your telegram yesterday. Lucky we were on maneuvers nearby. Thought you'd given up finding trouble after Mary passed." "Trouble found me," Jake said, glancing at the sisters. "Mike, meet Margaret, Rose, and Catherine Williams. Ladies, Captain Michael O'Brien, the ugliest cavalry officer in the Uwikers Army." "Charming as ever." O'Brien laughed. He tipped his hat to the ladies. "Heard about your situation from Judge Hartwell. Takes real courage to stand up to men like Morrison."
"We had help,"
Rose said, moving closer to Jake.
"The best help."
As the morning wore on, the full scope of their victory became clear. Morrison's network was shattered, his hired guns dead or captured, his political protection crumbling. Judge Watson had fled in the night, abandoning his cousin to justice. Documents found in Morrison's saddlebags revealed the extent of his land-grabbing scheme, dozens of families driven off, ruined, or worse. The house was a ruin, the barn still smoldering. But they were alive. More than that, they were free. As neighbors arrived to help the same folks who'd been too frightened to stand up before Jake felt the community reforming around them. "We'll rebuild," Sam Wheeler promised, surveying the damage. "Barn raising next week,
I'll donate the lumber.
I've got spare shingles, another rancher offered, and my boys can help with the work. Margaret's eyes filled with tears at the unexpected kindness. We can't repay all this. Don't need repayment, Wheeler said gruffly. Need neighbors who'll stand up when it counts. You folks showed us what courage looks like. Least we can do is help you rebuild. As the sun climbed higher, Jake found himself alone with Rose amid the ruins of his barn. She was soot-stained and exhausted, but her eyes held triumph. Think you can handle us all? She asked one more time, but now the question was soft, almost wondering. After all this, your home is destroyed because of us. Jake looked around at the damage, then at the woman before him. Home isn't buildings. Rose, it's people. Family. You three became my home the moment you stumbled in from that storm. Rose's smile was radiant through the dirt and exhaustion. Jake Sullivan, are you proposing? Maybe I am, Jake said, pulling her close. If you'll have a broken-down ex-ranger with a shot-up ranch and more stubbornness than sense. I think we can handle that, Rose murmured against his chest. All of us. The kiss that followed tasted of gunpowder and possibility, of endings and beginnings mixed together like prairie dust and morning dew. Hate to interrupt, Captain O'Brien called out with amusement. But Judge Hartwell's here. Wants to take statements while everything's fresh. They spent the afternoon giving testimony, Catherine's journal proving invaluable in establishing the pattern of Morrison's crimes. By evening, the federal prosecutor was confident they had enough to hang Morrison twice over. As the cavalry prepared to leave, taking the prisoners with them, Captain O'Brien pulled Jake aside. You've got something good here, he said, nodding toward the sisters. Don't let it slip away. Not planning to, Jake assured him. That night, they made camp near the ruins of the house Jake, the three sisters, and a handful of neighbors who insisted on standing guard. Around the campfire, stories were shared, plans were made, and slowly the terror of the morning transformed into something else: community, hope, future. Catherine, her arm bandaged but spirit unbroken, worked on a new journal entry by firelight. Margaret organized supplies with her usual efficiency, already planning the layout of the new house. And Rose sat beside Jake, their hands intertwined, watching sparks rise toward the stars. It's really over? Rose said quietly. Morrison's finished. We're free. Free to build something new. Jake agreed. Together. The word hung in the air like a promise. Tomorrow would bring challenges, trials, rebuilding, the hard work of making a life. But tonight, under the vast Wyoming sky, 4 souls who'd found each other through violence and loss finally had peace. Think you can handle us all? Rose whispered one last time. Jake squeezed her hand, looking from her to her sisters, seeing his future written in their faces. For the rest of my life, he promised. For the rest of my life. The stars wheeled overhead, eternal and unchanging, while below them, a new family forged in fire and courage began the long, sweet journey toward tomorrow. The courthouse in Cheyenne was packed to the rafters. Word had spread across 3 territories about the trial of Harrison Morrison, and folks came from far and wide to witness justice being served. Jake sat with the sisters in the front row, their Sunday best clothes a stark contrast to the rough garments they'd worn during their ordeal. Morrison sat at the defendant's table, his expensive lawyers flanking him like vultures. He'd aged visibly during his weeks in custody, the confident tyrant replaced by a desperate man grasping at any hope of escape. But Judge Hartwell presided with stern authority, allowing no theatrics or legal trickery. Catherine took the stand first, her journal in hand. Her voice, once trembling with fear, now rang clear as she recounted the horror of her mother's death, her father's murder, the months of terror, the journal entries, written in a young woman's careful hand, painted a damning picture of systematic cruelty. He came to our home when Papa was at market. Catherine read from a water-stained page. Mama sent us to hide in the root cellar. But we could hear everything, her screams, the sound of furniture breaking. When it was quiet, we found her on the kitchen floor, blood everywhere. She lived 3 more days, 3 days of agony. Her last words were, "Don't let him win." Margaret testified next, her composure cracking only when she described finding their father's broken body at the bottom of the ravine. The wagon wheel had been tampered with. The blacksmith in town confirmed it later. Though he was too frightened to speak up then, Morrison had him killed 2 months later. Another accident. Rose's testimony was fierce and uncompromising. She faced Morrison directly, green eyes blazing. You destroyed our family for water rights, for land, for pride. But you failed to break us. We survived. We fought. And now you'll face the justice you denied so many others. The prosecution presented witness after witness, ranchers driven from their homes, widows whose husbands had mysterious accidents, townspeople who'd lived in fear for years. Catherine's journal corroborated dates, times, threats Morrison had made, thinking himself untouchable. When Morrison's lawyers tried to paint the sisters as hysterical women seeking revenge, Jake took the stand. His testimony about the attacks on his ranch, delivered in the flat, factual tone of an ex-ranger, demolished their defense. Captain O'Brien followed, providing military precision to the account of the final battle. The trial lasted 3 days. When the jury returned after less than an hour's deliberation, no one was surprised by the verdict guilty on all counts. Judge Hartwell's sentence was swift and merciless. Harrison Morrison would hang for murder, conspiracy, and a host of other crimes. As they led Morrison away, he turned one last time to stare at the sisters, but where once his gaze had held threat and dominion, now there was only the hollow look of a beaten man. Catherine met his stare unflinchingly, and it was Morrison who looked away first. Outside the courthouse, in the crisp autumn air, the sisters stood close together, processing the end of their long nightmare. Neighbors and strangers alike approached to offer congratulations, support, and often their own stories of Morrison's cruelty finally avenged. "It's over," Margaret said wonderingly. "Really, truly over."
"The dying's over," Jake corrected gently. "Now the living begins."
They returned to the ranch to find transformation. True to their word, the community had rallied. A new barn stood where the old had burned, bigger and better built. The house had been repaired and expanded. Sam Wheeler's wife had insisted on a proper kitchen for all them ladies. There was even a small study for Catherine's books, donated by the schoolmarm in town. Standing before their rebuilt home, the sisters were overwhelmed. These people who'd been too frightened to help before had found courage in the sisters' example, and now repaid it tenfold. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table in their new kitchen, Jake cleared his throat nervously. "There's something I've been meaning to ask, to say." He pulled out a small box, revealing a simple gold ring. "Rose Williams, you burst into my life in a storm and turned everything upside down. You challenged me, fought beside me, gave me reason to live again. Will you marry me?" Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she was grinning. "Think you can handle me forever, Jake Sullivan?" "Forever and a day," he promised, slipping the ring onto her finger. "Wait," Catherine said suddenly. "What about us, Margaret and me?" Jake smiled. "Already thought of that. This ranch is big enough for a real family operation. Margaret, I could use a partner who knows her way around the books and the stock. Catherine, that teaching position in town is still open. If you're interested, this is your home for as long as you want it." Margaret's usual composure crumbled as she wiped away tears. "You do that, keep us all together." "Family stays together." Jake said simply, "That's what Mary would have wanted. It's what I want." The wedding took place 2 weeks later, with half the territory in attendance. Rose wore her mother's wedding dress, altered by Margaret's skilled hands. Catherine stood as maid of honor, while Captain O'Brien served as best man, having ridden back specially for the occasion. As they exchanged vows beneath the Wyoming sky, Jake thought of the journey that had brought them here, from loneliness and loss to love and family, from violence and fear to peace and hope. The preacher spoke of two becoming one, but Jake knew better 4 had become one, a family forged in hardship and sealed in love. The reception was held in the new barn, fiddle music and laughter echoing where gunfire had once rang. Jake watched his wife dancing with her sisters, their faces alight with joy, and felt Mary's presence like a blessing. She would have loved these women, would have opened her heart just as he had. "No regrets?" Captain O'Brien asked, joining him with 2 glasses of whiskey. "None," Jake said firmly. "You? Only that I didn't bet money on you ending up married again. Rose is a force of nature." "That she is," Jake agreed proudly. "They all are." As the evening wound down, Judge Hartwell approached with news. "The federal investigation has uncovered more of Morrison's crimes. His assets are being seized. There's a strong case for returning the Williams Ranch to its rightful owners, along with compensation for damages." The sisters exchanged glances, but it was Margaret who spoke. "Thank you, Judge, but I think we've found where we belong." Catherine nodded. "This is home now, though the money would help expand the school library." "And buy better breeding stock," Margaret added practically. "And maybe a new Winchester," Rose said with a grin, making Jake laugh. As the last guests departed and stars filled the sky, the new family stood together on their porch. The ranch stretched out before them, no longer a monument to one man's grief, but a promise of shared tomorrows. "Think you can handle us all?" Rose asked one final time, nestled against Jake's side. Jake looked at his wife, at her sisters, who were now his sisters too, at the home they'd built from ashes and determination. "Already am," he said contentedly. "Already am." Margaret and Catherine headed inside, giving the newlyweds a moment alone. Rose turned in Jake's arms, studying his weathered face in the moonlight. "No more storms," she said softly. "No more running. No more fighting for our lives." "Just living," Jake agreed. "Day by day, season by season, together." They stood there, 2 souls who'd found each other in the crucible of violence and emerged stronger for it. Behind them, the house glowed with lamplight and the promise of family. Before them, the prairie stretched endless beneath the stars, full of possibilities. The wind whispered through the grass, gentler now, carrying not the scent of gunpowder and fear, but of sage and home. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, answered by another. And another, a reminder that even in the wildest places, none were meant to be alone. Rose smiled up at him, that fierce, beautiful smile that had first captured his heart. "Welcome to your new life, Jake Sullivan. Think you're ready for whatever comes next?" Jake kissed her, pouring all his love and certainty into the gesture. When they finally parted, both breathless, he gave the only answer that mattered. "With you always." Hand in hand, they walked into their home, where Margaret had tea brewing and Catherine was already lost in a new book. The family that fate and courage had created settled in for another evening together, safe in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, they'd face it as one. The Wild West had thrown its worst at them: violence, loss, injustice, and pain. But they'd survived, thrived, and built something beautiful from the ashes. In the end, love had proven stronger than hate, family stronger than fear, and hope stronger than all the darkness Morrison and his kind could muster. Their story would be told around campfires and in town squares for generations, the tale of 3 sisters who refused to break, a lonely rancher who found his heart again, and how together they stood against tyranny and won. But for now, in this moment, They were simply family, and that was more than enough. Thank you all for listening to this Wild West love story. If you're enjoying these tales of courage, love, and justice from the American frontier, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more stories that bring the Old West to life. What did you think of Jake and the Williams sisters' journey? Share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, partners.